Hello everyone, this is Hardik. I'm one of the co-founders of Flatic. With me I have Aishwarya. She's a childhood friend and a lawyer by profession. We were having a very interesting conversation the other day and we thought it's good if we can share it with other people. So Aishwarya, without wasting much time, why don't you just introduce the topic?
Hi, first of all, hello everyone. I'm Aishwarya. I am an intellectual property and a tech lawyer by profession. As Hardik has already mentioned, we've been friends since childhood. And I think both of us are doing something like this for the very first time. But we're really excited to share the discussion that we've had a couple of days ago. So, we've been discussing about data brokers and about their origins, how they function, why they have been relevant for so long within the data industry, and what kind of rules and regulations have come in to govern them. We're kind of trying to analyze their rise and comment on whether or not we will see a fall anytime soon. So Hardik, why don't you just start by telling us what are data brokers and how did they actually come into being?
Beyond you, your friends, your parents, if there's anyone else who knows more about you, I think it's the data brokers of the world. How they do it and why they do it, those are questions we'll answer later, right? But essentially, data brokers are people who maintain user profiles about each and every individual that they can get their hands on. They were built to cater to specific industries. Let's say finance is one of the industries, marketing is one of the industries, people search or background verification is one of the industries. So data brokers are middlemen or data aggregators, like they're called sometimes. Recently, a term has been coined which is called data management platforms or DMPs. These are also data brokers in all practicality.
Can you just elaborate a little bit more on their business models? Like, I understand that historically speaking, data brokers were people who went door to door to collect information from people, let's say about their insurance policies or with respect to loans, and then they used to keep like physical files. How do you think that has evolved over the years?
Yeah, I think you're spot on in terms of how they came into being, right? So data brokers are not at all a new concept. Data brokers have existed for more than 100 years. We didn't even have digital data back then. Data probably just meant profiles of users, right? So I think Equifax is one of the earliest data brokers that came into being somewhere in the late 1800s. Founders of Equifax were actually insurance salesmen, and they noticed that every time someone bought an insurance, the insurance companies did a background verification or a background check on the property or the people who are buying it. And they were all working in silos and there was a lot of redundancy in the system. So they figured, why not create a centralized system where we can maintain a record of all the individuals who might be potential buyers of insurance. And, from the centralized repository, we could just serve the background verification check whenever any insurance company makes a query against a particular user. So, like you mentioned, these are essentially just user profiles, and the terminology has stuck ever since because even today, if you do a CIBIL report pull or a CRIF or Equifax report pull, if you don't have enough history, your history is essentially called a thin file. So the file is essentially coming from the user profile or the actual physical file of documents that people use to maintain. So I think the terminology has stuck ever since. But yeah, I think in terms of the value addition, obviously they figured out the most efficient way to go about these background verification checks. Centralization was a very straightforward and obvious answer to bringing in efficiency into the system. But I think ever since, the data that they have been capturing has changed. Who has been buying this data has changed. Even how we perceive our own identities and what kind of footprint we leave behind, that has changed as well. So a lot of things have changed since the start of the history of data brokers. And I think in the new context, what they do and how they do it is completely different. So probably we can just discuss more about what data brokers are doing today.
But so before getting into what they're doing lately, I just want to delve a little bit into what kind of information they've collected and also how this information has become so valuable today.
Yeah, again, Aishwarya, absolutely spot on, right? I was just reading a report before we started recording this, which mentioned data brokers today stand at around $270 billion of valuation. And if you were to apply for a loan on a credit card or let's say a personal loan or a home loan, right? Every application, every sign up on a lender's website, one of the calls goes to the credit bureaus and they share a particular report that has all of your financial history. If you have ever taken loans before, how was your repayment history back then? Are you salaried or self-employed? Who is your employer? Say, what's your typical income range annually or monthly level, right? And a lot of other details. So assuming that data brokers have made themselves essential not just in fintech, but also in other industries. It is not a massive surprise that they're valued at $270 billion today. But just to answer your question in terms of what all data points do they capture or where do they operate, right? I think finance is something that we discussed extensively. Marketing is another such area where data brokers have had a very huge impact. Again, it started long back when there was no
Right.
digital media, but people wanted to do targeted communications or send out offers for their stores. So people started with mailing lists. And there were only a handful bunch of people who knew what mailing lists had what demographics of users or what mailing lists were catering to a particular location and so on, right? So the fundamental role of data brokers in marketing hasn't changed much because even today, data brokers help primarily in the targeting part of advertising or marketing. But yeah, how they operate in terms of what kind of data points do they have access to, given now we have a lot of digital footprint, the depth of the data and the breadth of the data both have changed massively, right? There are other data brokers as well. You might have heard of something called PQ, or let's say like a people
Yeah.
search engine. All of these
Yeah.
are essentially people search engines. There are also some AI based search engines now. I was just reading up on whitebridge.ai is something that helps you figure out everything there is to know about you from a public standpoint, right? If you have a Facebook profile or a LinkedIn profile,
Correct.
if you have written some kind of articles in the past, or if you have been mentioned in some of the articles, all of those things are collated together and can be used for maybe background verification if you're onboarding an employee or if you're onboarding a vendor, and a bunch of other things that you could think might be helpful. So primarily
Right.
finance, marketing, people search, these have been the areas where data brokers have grown a lot and added a lot of value over the last, I don't know, few decades. But yeah, I'm sure there are other data brokers that operate in more niche segments, which act as aggregators for niche data that caters to, let's say, a specific manufacturing setup or a very specific industry, and so on. The footprint that we leave behind has opened up, and how many touch points we have now as compared to what people had, say, 4 or 5 decades ago. I understand the value that data brokers have been adding in the industry, right? And they've been growing quite big. But my perception of law is generally to protect the interests of the people. So whenever there is some kind of event that might indicate potential harm to people, that is what triggers regulating a
Right.
particular industry. So I just want to understand from you the background of that in terms of data brokers specifically. Was there any kind of event like that which triggered this kind of regulation? And if yes, what was it? And how did the regulation go about handling that?
Yeah. So I think to answer that, I'm going to go to 1970s United States because
Okay,
that's where all of it began. That's where Equifax was also present.
correct.
So essentially, back in the 1970s, when credit reporting became a thing, is when people started realizing that the kind of information that is getting collected about them and is being shared with lending companies, with banks, or with even employers for that matter, that all of that information matters a lot, because any kind of decision made based on the information that is available to these middlemen who are selling it off to companies who might in the future either employ you or who might be giving you some kind of a loan or some insurance policy or things like that. So they
Yeah.
started, and again, 1970s US was not the most non-discriminatory country. So essentially, if someone knew if you were of a particular segment of people, your income, all of these things mattered a lot. And the minute they started realizing that this is becoming a cause of discrimination, a cause for denying certain rights to certain sect or certain group of people, is when they realized this has to be regulated. These middlemen, however they are collecting this information, it has to be regulated, which is when they came up in the 1970 with the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which is
Yeah.
known as FCRA now. So FCRA is essentially something that regulates consumer reporting agencies in the United States. So what they'll do is, these agencies of course are companies that collate information for providing credit, employment, insurance and related reports to whosoever is buying them. Pretty much similar to what happens today, just that the application of these things has expanded beyond just credit, insurance, housing, employment. So FCRA basically ensured maximum accuracy of the information that got collected, and they also said ki, okay, if you're collecting information, if you're going to put it in a database, you need to give people access to this information, so that if they want to rectify it, delete it, it should be open to them. To put it simply, FCRA gave that information back to the people, gave right to that information back to those who actually own it.
Just a question on this one, right? So you talked about two things. You talked about access or right to the information that we essentially own. And you also talked about accuracy of the information about us in a particular report. So I think the access part is something that was, I'm assuming, pretty effective, because if you go onto any of these websites today, you can easily get a free report from a TransUnion or a Equifax or any other credit bureau that is out there. The accuracy bit, I'm not very sure of, because like I used to work for before this, and there was a feature in that essentially helped people look at their credit reports, and just in case they could find any kind of discrepancy, there was a reporting flow, but the reporting flow was very, very rudimentary, in the sense if you clicked on report discrepancy inside the app, it will open your Gmail or your mailbox. It will put the TransUnion email address as a recipient. It will auto-populate the email as a template in terms of what discrepancy and your identifiers and so on. And that was it. I don't think there are any legitimate rails for us to communicate this back to the bureau, and I don't think there are any SLAs per se that are enforced on these bureaus to actually verify some information and then rectify it. And that's what I know. I'm not sure if there are regulations or guidelines around it or not.
The FCRA did have some kind of reporting and supervisory authority taking care of all of these things. Supervisory authority here being the FTC, which is the Federal Trade Commissions. And they used to take care of all of these things if complaints were raised. Now, of course, there's not much data that I came across which shows how many complaints were raised back then on this particular issue. But if we come to today's scenario, I mean, the modern privacy laws, they started developing alongside the GDPR. Like, of course, they've been in discussion for years now, especially in Europe. The evolution of privacy law dates back to, I think, the 1960s. And then the modern day privacy law obviously came in with the GDPR. GDPR definitely focuses and emphasizes on right to rectification and right to access to the data subject. And these are two very principal rights which are present in almost every data privacy regime that has come up ever since. Even in India's DPDP, which is yet to be enforced, this act also gives both of these rights to the data principal to access their own data, to rectify it, to delete it as well. So definitely when the act comes into picture, it is going to change some of these things with respect to how a particular database is managed by a particular broker or an aggregator company.
Makes sense. So given you have just touched upon DPDPA, coming back to current day India, so DPDPA, like you said, is not notified yet, it's not enforced yet, right? So in absence of DPDPA, how are data brokers, let's say, in the fintech industry or the ad tech industry currently being regulated?
This is actually a little tricky because we are in kind of a gray area, but not completely in the dark is what I would say. There are sectoral regulators operating right now. Essentially, data broker or a data aggregator is not defined in any of these laws. Not even DPDPA talks about it. They all talk about third-party companies collecting and storing information on behalf of somebody else, or collecting and storing information for sharing with somebody else. So right now, if we talk sector-wise, for the financial sector, definitely RBI is around. RBI has their own guidelines to navigate through these waters. Credit Information Companies Regulation that came out in 2005 is a counterpart. It does the exact same thing that FCRA does in the US. They are targeting credit report agencies, and this is regulated by the Reserve Bank of India. So any kind of complaint that you have within the finance sector with aggregator platforms can be raised with the RBI. Secondly, what can be done is the Consumer Protection Act also provides you the right to file consumer complaint against any credit information company. So let's say if you have any issue with your CIBIL score, you have the right to go to the consumer court and tell them the report that CIBIL has generated for me has certain flaws, has certain errors, is probably miscalculated, or the information that they have is not updated.
Most of what you are mentioning is about the credit reporting agencies or the finance sector, but we have seen data brokers have added a lot of value and are valued at $270 billion. A majority of that is also the ad tech sector, right? So, do you think for data brokers that primarily operate in the marketing side of things, are they regulated today, or are there any kind of guidelines or best practices for data brokers to operate there?
So, unfortunately, adtech is one sector which does not have a lot of guidelines when it comes to somebody who's using your information or sharing your information with third parties. Advertising in general is governed by the Advertising Standard Council of India, that is ASCI. They have their code of conduct for companies who are publishing advertisements, but
Yeah.
ASCI's guidelines focus on the content of the advertising, but they do not go into whom you should target this particular advertisement to, whom you should not be targeting this advertisement to. All of this is supposed to be covered by the DPDPA when it comes into picture. So we're kind of
Got
waiting
it.
for the laws to be active, for the ad tech sector to be regulated a little bit. But
My mom and dad have a health insurance that I bought. I'm also a part of it because, I'm young and it doesn't cost much to insure me. So it was just expiring end of last month. And towards the last week of the insurance, I got calls from around 4 or 5 different insurers slash insurance brokers, none of which were my insurer, by the way. And they knew a lot about me. They knew my name, they knew my phone number because they called me, they knew my address, they knew both of my parents' names. They knew what kind of illnesses they have already declared. They knew what was the coverage of my existing insurance, and they were trying to upsell me. When I tried to ask them where they got all of this information from, they just said, "Sir, वो company से sheet आई है." Right? And obviously, I told them that there's this new law called as DPDPA, and this is pretty sensitive information because it is related to my health and my parents' health, and your company could get fined up to 250 crore rupees for something like this. And thankfully, these people have not called me ever since. But yeah, I meant to discuss this with you in terms of, if something like this happens, and clearly, I mean, my data was just with my insurer. I don't want to name them, but what is the remedy that I can seek in such a situation?
well, it's a tricky one. Although, funnily, I'm sure that this sheet must have gotten to whosoever was calling you through some insurance broker. Like,
Yep.
there has to be some link. They can't just randomly get hands on somebody's file like that, right? There are insurance brokers regulations of 2018 which were launched by the IRDAI, and they specifically mandate insurance companies and insurance brokers to not share personal information without consent. So there's like a regulation operating against them, and they are mandated to keep all information that they collect confidential, and they have to also take appropriate steps to maintain that confidentiality. Now, with respect to third-party administrators that we are talking about, specifically with respect to health services, there's another regulation that operates, which says if you're going to sell somebody health insurance, you cannot share the customer data or the personal information that is received for servicing insurance policies or claims. So things like this do exist. I think people aren't talking as much about it as much as they should. But fortunately, in the last couple of years, we've seen this rise in people understanding about privacy laws, understanding about why it is important to know where you're sharing this information before anything else. This kind of literacy is just starting to develop and spread across the country. So let's just hope that we'll become a more privacy literate nation a few years down the line. But interestingly, I just want to go back to that one question. How do you think these brokers even get their hands on this data?
Yeah. So I don't know how people get hands on, let's say, health data and any of that sorts, but typically how data brokers operate is there are a lot of different companies and services that you use, right? You use Uber for mobility, you use certain transaction apps and a bunch of other services on your phone, on your desktop, and even probably offline. So all of these different companies have certain amount of data, profiling data about you. Say a payment aggregator might really understand your transaction history very well. Another
Yeah.
app on your phone might understand where you're moving or where you spend most of your time in life, right? For example, Uber
Hmm.
could easily tell you where your home address is, where your office address is, and so on. So there are a bunch of different breadcrumbs that we are leaving behind with all of these different companies. Most of the data brokers,
Right.
they have contracts with all of these companies. They try to get as many sources as possible, and they have data licensing agreements with all of these companies where they get, let's say, a one-time dump of all the data of all the users that a particular company may be catering to. And, essentially,
Hmm.
once you aggregate all of these different sources, you try to match it with a common identifier. For example, if I have to create a profile about
Yeah.
you, I might use your email ID as a common identifier, or I might use your name as a common identifier, or your home location as a common identifier, right? And I'll try to stitch this whole picture from different aspects of your life and different breadcrumbs you have spread across different digital geographies. As a result, what they get is a full picture, a full user profile. Now, depending on who's buying, they're able to bring out the nuance out of that user profile or personalize it in a
Hmm.
way so that you can cater to a particular B2B customer, and it goes to the highest bidder, any bidder for that matter. Yeah, I mean that's how most of these data brokers are getting their hands on a lot of data. It is a lot of contracts between data brokers and all the companies that we ourselves have given consent to operate on our data, share our data,
And
derive insights out of our data.
interestingly, that makes me think about how this will all be regulated when the new law kicks in. But essentially, I feel that most, correct me if I'm wrong, most of this information that they get their hands on is publicly available information. Is that correct?
I don't think so. So a lot of the
Okay.
information is actually not publicly available. On social media, probably what is the kind of information that you put out? You might have visited a restaurant, you checked in somewhere. That is, let's say, one point of interest for you that, okay, you like Italian
Yeah.
food, right? That is public information. Or these are the set of people that you hang out with, the friends that you might have put up photos with. That is public information. But what you'd like to order on a food delivery app, or where your office is, or how frequently do you go to office, or are you more like a hybrid worker or a work from home worker, all of this information is private and is known only to certain services or apps that we use for a specific purpose. So I don't think majority of the data that data brokers hold is publicly scraped. I would still say more than 70-80% of the data is
A
coming
lot
from
of it is.
other proprietary data sets.
So essentially, you mean to say that these all of these apps that we use today are interconnected to each other, and somewhere or the other, some company is sharing my information with somebody else, and because
That's right.
I am not thinking so much about it, I haven't gone through the entire privacy policy to understand where all my data is moving.
Yeah. By the way, there is a app that could help you with this one, right? So I was just researching for today's recording. There is an app called as Cognito. What it does is it will take all of your information. It will take your name, all of your email IDs, all of your phone numbers, where you have
Huh.
lived in the past, etc., etc. And based on that, what it does is it maps all the data brokers and what all data points they have about you. And then through Cognito, through a paid service, you can request deletion of your data across all of these data brokers. This is not an advertisement, but I really liked what they're doing. I think it will be really valuable in the coming years.
That's actually really very cool. I mean, I think every one of us, especially uh, now that we are so interconnected and so dependent on apps, that we would need more tools like this to come into picture to help
Yeah.
us understand. Okay, coming back to the topic, you were just talking about uh, how the business model of data brokers actually work, in the sense that how they collect information and keep it all together.
Yeah.
So how do you think this is helping, not helping? What do you think should change?
My strong opinion only comes from one factor, which is centralization of data. And I'll give you a couple of examples to just visualize
Mm-hmm.
what kind of harm can come from centralization of data, right? What we are doing at LATIC is in a primary way different than what data brokers do, because we do not believe in centralization. We believe that all of these data collaborations should be fully decentralized. And let me give you an example of how centralization of data can be harmful. So I think around a decade back, or probably more than that, have you heard of this website called as Kaggle?
No, not really.
So if you ever plan to leave law and go into data science, because everything's going on the AI side of things, the first website that you'll land on is Kaggle, which is like a marketplace of data science competitions that are happening all around the world, right? So even companies and corporations, they participate on Kaggle by sponsoring certain contests and sponsoring certain data sets. I think 10, 12 years back, Netflix had put up a data set of watch history of some of their users and the recommendations that they showed to them. The contest was essentially about designing the most optimum recommendation algorithm for Netflix. This seems pretty harmless, right? All of it was de-anonymized. There was no personal information involved there. There were some random gibberish alphanumeric keys which were representing individual users, no identifiers at all. But what happened was there were a bunch of data scientists who went on to IMDb. IMDb, if you know, has a lot of public profiles and all of the reviews that you write about different
Yeah,
movies along with the timestamps, right? So they just linked the Netflix
correct.
data set with the IMDb data set, and they tried to figure out, okay, based on the timestamps of different reviews that you might have written on different movies, which are the people that we can de-anonymize from the Netflix dataset, and they were able to de-anonymize a lot of them. So by intention, Netflix
Okay.
did this to sponsor a contest, to push data science forward, to make a better recommendation algorithm. They did everything right. They de-anonymized it. But just by linkage of a publicly available data set and a proprietary data set, people were able to figure out more information and watch histories of people, right? I wouldn't want to share my watch history with anyone. And this is still a fun example. If you're talking about a more serious example, this is something that happened again in the US. The US census data was just published, and what people tried to do was, there was another public data set that was a medical data set about symptoms and what kind of
Right.
medications have been given to these patients and so on, right? What people did was they tried to link the medical data set, which was again completely de-anonymized, and they tried to link it with the US census data, and they were able to uncover the identity of the governor of Massachusetts, and by extension, they were able to understand what was his medical history and what medication he was on. Right. So this is something that is pretty serious, and all of these, for me, they point towards only one key theme, which is centralization of data. What we do at LATEC is
Right.
completely different than this, because we believe that if two companies want to collaborate on data, the right way to do it is to pull in the data just in time, on demand, never to store it, never to read the raw data, derive whatever insights you want out of it just in time, and then the data vanishes, right? So essentially, we
Right.
don't want to create profiles of users, or we don't want to store all of these details or raw data about users at all, because that is something only the user should have access to, or the person or organization that has been defined as the guardian of this data should have access to. So that is my big problem with centralization,
Right.
and which is why I also believe data brokers really need to pivot their model. And I'm sure the regulators and the lawmakers will take notice of this.
But on that note, I just want to quickly ask one question. When you said publicly available data sets, what would those entail? Like complete entire data sets that are available to everybody for use? Or does it mean a data set collected with publicly available information?
So publicly available information, whenever you collect all of that, or scrape, like people call it, right? It's called open source intelligence per se. When I'm saying publicly available data sets, those were proprietary data sets that someone had collected privately, and then either for a research purpose or for some kind of insights
Okay.
were published later on, and public was given
So
access to that
essentially
data
like
set.
an open source model.
Correct. There are models which have their architecture as open source. There are models who have their weights as open source. There are even models that give out the data sets that they were trained on, to give transparency into how it was trained, and what was the data that was used, whether it was biased or whether it was valid and balanced and so on, right? So I think open source itself is not a magic terminology, right? Open source can mean a different layer of things depending on what layer you're operating at.
Absolutely.
One of the things that I've been thinking about, I can understand all of this and I have a strong point of view about it because I've read about it, I've talked to people about it. But what I want to understand is, where does the law stand on all of this, given the breadth of information that data brokers hold today and the level of centralization that they have done? Do you think it is still legal, or are there any laws that prevent any one entity or one organization from gathering too much information about a user? Is there some framework or some guideline or something in the works that might help people, sigh a breath of relief?
So, to answer that question, Hardik, there are definitely existing laws that govern privacy, but they are restricted in the sense maybe the fintech sector being regulated by the SPDI guidelines. These guidelines have been in operation since 2009, and they essentially cover all the sensitive financial information that you share with your banks or your NBFCs, and this is again directed and regulated by the RBI. Apart from this, the privacy laws in the country right now are not as expansive. We are still waiting for our new law to come in. When it does come in, some of these things are definitely going to change. So essentially for data brokers, the first challenge would be to understand whether to define them as a data processor or as a data fiduciary. So a lot of these companies who might have directly collected information and kept and stored it with themselves, and they might be selling that information to somebody else, like you've mentioned previously. So this kind of a company can, for that particular transaction, be termed as a data fiduciary because they did collect certain information from the end user and then they saved it.
Yeah.
There would be other companies linked who are simply collecting or processing or storing information on behalf of a fiduciary, which is when you would call them a processor. Somebody who
Got it.
takes it, stores it, analyzes it, sells it further.
So would you say that data brokers will still
Right.
fall in one of these two, and there will be certain responsibilities that will be attached to a data fiduciary and a data processor, right? Where do you think, because
I
it's not
think
very clear to me whether data brokers, given they are the ones who are holding the data, maybe they don't have a direct relationship with the user at all, but they are still holding a lot of data on all the users that they may or may not have a direct relationship with. So I'm not sure whether to categorize them as a data fiduciary or a data processor.
correct. So it's actually a very tricky situation when you talk about middlemen like these, because you're right that they wouldn't fall into one or the other definition, but it will essentially depend upon the kind of transaction that you are involved in or the transaction that the data broker is involved in. It you will have to go on a case by case basis to understand how this particular broker has gathered information. Was it through multiple licensing contracts or multiple sharing contracts with different companies who were directly in touch with end consumers, or was it by accessing some publicly available data set, or was it by scraping information from people's social media profiles? It has to be circumstantially seen where they will fall, and then objectively determined whether they will be termed as a processor or they will be termed as a fiduciary. This will be the very first step in the analysis if ever a situation like this comes to light or goes to court. The first analysis would be this, because the liability for a fiduciary and the liability for a processor will differ vastly. If you are able to prove yourself as a data processor, you are still relatively less liable compared to a data fiduciary. And
Yeah.
India's DPDPA Act is going to be an extremely consent heavy regime.
Yeah.
If you compare it to GDPR or some of the other global laws that have come, you will see that they have certain other legitimate grounds as well for processing information. For instance, fraud detection could be one of the reasons why a particular processor is processing your information.
Correct.
Now, if you look at it from a fraud detection kind of a perspective, a bank might have hired a tool or a company who's analyzing your information that is provided by the bank directly to just to understand whether or not you are a fraud. right? So this middleman company will always have the protection in the terms that they will be called as a data processor itself, because they will be getting this information from the bank. They will be acting on the behest of the bank, and on the information collected directly by them, analyzing it and then sending back a report. So definitely in this context, this is going to be a processor. But there are going to be situations where this might contractually be allowed to use this information to, either develop their own tool or give it out to somebody else. In those situations, it will really have to be seen whether they will be termed as a processor, or it would be like a step up for them and they would become a fiduciary. And I'll tell you,
Got it.
little bit of clarity comes from GDPR also, because GDPR strictly says that a processor is someone who will act on the behest of the data fiduciary, or the data controller is what GDPR, the term which is used. So a data controller will tell you what and how of the particular processing activity that you have to do, and the processor is somebody who just executes it.
Yeah.
You have to understand it like that. So essentially,
sense.
it will come down to a very case by case, very objective analysis, and you can't put a blanket definition for data brokers.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. I've been looking at this more from a economics perspective, right? In terms of more like a demand and supply kind of a thing. So I think
Uh-huh.
every organization, it would be a crime if I said most of the organizations. So I want to say every single organization today wants to be data driven, right? Probably people used to make business decisions based on their intuition 20 years back. Now they've started being data driven. People are not going back to intuition, right? It is only going to get more and more data driven now, especially with AI coming into the
Correct.
picture. It's the graph is just going up and up, right? So there is definitely more and more demand for data, or more and more demand for understanding your own user or your own customer from different perspectives, so that you are able to personalize the services or give them something that they might be really interested in, right? So I think from a demand perspective, it is definitely going up. But at the same time, I'm also slightly apprehensive about how this data broker kind of a model is operating, right? And whether there are newer ways which could potentially kind of fulfill this additional demand that is coming in, and probably also take up the demand that the data brokers are currently fulfilling with their current operations, right? So I've been listening to a bunch of very interesting stuff. One of the very obvious solutions is what we are doing. We say, okay, let's
Yeah.
whenever a data is coming out of any kind of service or a app provider, we tie it to a very specific purpose. Let's say your purpose is to determine affluence of Aishwarya, right? So the data should be properly used only for that specified purpose. You make it just in time, you make it on demand, and once the insight is derived out of it, you could discard all the data that there is, right? That you don't need to know that Aishwarya bought
Right.
Logitech AirPods for, let's say, 10,000 rupees on Myntra on a Saturday. You probably just need to know that, okay, Aishwarya has enough paying capacity to buy lifestyle products, or she's credit worthy, and she gets a salary every month. That is enough. So that is one way, but there are a couple of other interesting ways that I've been coming across, right? So recently I had put up a post, Vana Labs, right? So what they're doing is, have you heard of a decentralized autonomous organization, what people call a DAO?
Mhm.
So
I
essentially what
don't
people are.
fully get it, but yeah.
Sure. So, I mean, DAOs are pretty simple, right? So, what DAOs are right now, there are companies have their own management, and you are essentially handing over your data. You're saying, okay, please take care of this data and give me the best service you can. Instead of this, what a DAO is, it is an autonomous organization, which means if you are one of the data contributors to this DAO, you also get a say in terms of what happens to this data, where is this data monetized, and do I get something in return if I choose to monetize this data, or if I vote in favor of monetization of data, right? So people are now creating these data DAOs
Okay.
where they are kind of pooling all of their information and then using this pooled information for a specific purpose. Say, for example, I was to train a LLM, right? Just
That's
my chat history or my information, my data will not be enough for a large language model. But if I can find a million other people like me who are ready to train a large language model on their chat histories and their data, I can potentially form a data DAO. And this data DAO can then have complete democratized ownership over a collective pool of data, and we can all collectively decide what happens with it, right? So that is an amazing concept. I don't know how it will scale or how it will look like 5 years from now, but yeah, I mean it's a interesting concept, right? The other concept that I recently was talking about someone with was about agents, right? So, I mean, you must be seeing your Twitter feed or X feed, where there are a lot of different AI agents people are building, right? So, there are some people who are working on negotiator agents, right? Which means if your data is parked with company A, and say company A is doing a data transaction with company B, now your negotiator AI agent can go and be part of that transaction and say, if you are trading my data, what do I get in return? Right? And this agent can understand what you value. It can understand the personalized value that is important to you, right? If you value your XYZ data versus is a 10% off on your next Swiggy order more valuable to you, right? So essentially a agent that is present whenever these transactions take place and who is representing your interest based on your personalized likes and dislikes, right? So even things like these, again, in today's context, probably this is a major overkill and it will take a lot of energy and a lot of infrastructure to implement this. But there are a lot of interesting concepts that are out there trying to act in the opposite direction of what data brokers are trying to do, where instead of giving more control to the users who own the data, these transactions are happening completely blindly. I'm sure, I mean, I'll keep sharing it with you as and when I talk to new interesting people or come across some very interesting blog that is talking about new ways to do this. But I think, like a very strong opinion, but the old ways of doing it, which is, just holding all of this data together and trying to build profiles on top of it, I think these ways really need to change, or these companies may not exist, say, 5 or 10 years from now.
So we do have a prediction then. Do you think it's that soon that the data broker companies are going to shut shop?
Are you seeing the speed at which the world is changing right now? Are you seeing the speed at which new applications are being developed? So I think what used to take probably 5 years to happen in 2015 to 2020, right? I think it can happen in a year
Yeah.
in the age of 2025, or maybe even sooner.
I think that's what I was also discussing with somebody the other day. We were just talking about software updates. So back when we were using the desktop computers and we were playing games on that, the software updates used to come like probably once in 1.5 year or so. This I'm talking late 90s, okay? And then eventually they became a little more uh, frequent. And now it's almost about every 2 or 3 days that you have a update being rolled out. Or even if you
Yeah.
think about operating system updates, these have also started coming in a lot more frequently. So I do get the pace that you're talking about, but I still think that the traditional data broker business has a little more left in them before they go out of business, or they might pivot and turn into a completely new model.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, given we talked a bunch about the US, we talked a bunch about India, right? One thing that I definitely want to park here as part of the opinions that I hold, right? So if you look at the framework that India has adopted, right, it's called the Data Empowerment and Protection Architecture. You see, the empowerment comes before the protection, because in the US or Europe, people were already economically rich, and then they got data rich because all of these applications came around. Whereas in India, our GDP per capita is still very, very low, but all of us are doing digital transactions. All of us are super active on social. All of us are active on OTTs, and all of us are on all the convenience apps. So India is data rich before it is economically rich. So what the Indian think tanks are probably thinking about is, why not use this data movement for empowerment of individuals before we over index on the protection aspect of it. It is important, and there need
I
to
know,
be
yeah.
laws. There need to be laws that prevent harm from coming to any people because someone was, kind of irresponsible with their data. But at the same time, India is trying to strike that balance between data empowerment and data protection, so that being, protective about our data. At the same time, can we make sure that more people are included in the economy, more people are included in the credit ecosystem, and so on, so that, the growth curve of India doesn't slow down because of any kind of, conservative
Right.
measures.
Absolutely. And I think that's also because all of these things have been quite new in India. So, what US and Europe have probably experienced in terms of what could go wrong paves the way for us to develop better laws and to avoid the mistakes that they made. And
Yeah.
recently, even during the last parliament session, when our Minister of Electronics and Information Technology, Mr. Ashwini Vaishnav, was questioned about the path that India is taking with respect to this, was more in terms of AI regulation, but I feel like it applies to in generally regulation of technology. And he said, he's been very open about it, and he said that it has to be a innovation first approach that we take in India. And
Yeah.
that has been the case even with respect to intellectual property laws when they were developing, that we decided on taking a more innovation first, more business first, empowerment first approach compared to regulation. So we would want regulation, but we would not want the heavy penalties that come along with it. And
Yeah.
we've seen many companies have struggled doing business in Europe because of the strictness that GDPR has brought in.
Yeah.
It is really difficult for people to, keep a track of GDPR, the developments that come in, the regulations, I mean, the sub regulations that are there under the main regulation. So, definitely, India is one of those countries who's taking an empowerment first approach, and I think it's really brilliant the way that they're doing.
Yep. All right, then I mean that's a good note to actually end the podcast, right? And we are obviously very hopeful about what India has to offer to the world with this unique kind of balanced approach. And Aishwarya, I really hope we get to do this again, probably on a completely different topic next time. Every time we have a very interesting chat, right? I think we should just hit pause on that chat, start recording, and then kind of continue what we were talking about. Cool. Thank you for
Yeah,
doing
I would
this.
actually
Let's
love
do
that.
it again.
For sure, the next time on some other topic, definitely some other day.